Hello, good afternoon. We're thrilled to be presenting on how the tax code can help renters. For those of you who have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Michael Santos. I'm the Associate Director of U.S. Policy at Results, a national grassroots lobbying organization that helps create the political will to end poverty in Congress. I am also the chair of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty and the vice chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Economic Justice Committee. I will be your moderator today, so thank you all for joining us. So this panel is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, ABA section of Taxation, and the ABA Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit our website, americanbar.org/CRSJ, for updates on these programs. So during today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A. I know we have the chat enabled, but please put your questions on the Q&A so that we'll be able to look into whether we have the time to answer them. If you do not see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We'll be monitoring the Q&A and we will do our best, again, to address those questions, time permitting. We will be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. So briefly, before we actually move on to the substance of today's webinar, as a matter of the ABA policy, the ABA urges federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal governments to amend existing laws or enact new laws to provide financial support to tenants of rental housing and urges these governments to provide administrative agencies with adequate financial resources to implement and administer any such provisions. If you'd like to know more about that policy, check out the link that's shared on the chat. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A if you have any follow-up questions on the ABA policy. Now, I know we don't have a lot of time together. We'll have the panelists answer a few questions and then open it up for Q&A towards the end. But in the course of this webinar, we also want to hear from you and get to know you. So feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourself, where you're from, how you're interested in this topic. And as a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A box. For now, what we're going to do is actually get to know you a bit more. We have a couple of polling questions that I'm hoping my colleague could help launch. So these are two questions. One is, how do you agree to the statement that I have knowledge or I'm familiar with renter tax credits? So the choices are you strongly disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. And we'll do 15 seconds for folks to enter their responses, and then we'll move on to the next question. Okay, Ali, can you please move to the next question? Okay, great. So just looking at the results, it seems like a lot of folks still have room to learn about renter tax credits. And I think this is going to be a very, very robust discussion, a beginning of a robust discussion on this topic. The next question is just getting to know who you are and what your professional affiliation is. So please feel free to check the box of what you identified the most in terms of your professional affiliation, whether you're a person with lived experience of housing instability, homelessness, or poverty, you work for the government, whether that's state, local, or federal, you work for a nonprofit, you're part of a faith-based group, you're a lawyer or legal advocate, you're a grassroots or concerned citizen, or you're in academia, or you work for Congress. Or if none of the choices fit in, just check the other box. So again, we'll give it another 10 seconds before we close this out, and then we'll move right along. All right. Go ahead. Okay, so majority of our audience is mostly lawyers and legal advocates, so that's great to hear. But for those of you who are not lawyers or you work for the government, hopefully you find, or nonprofit, hopefully you find the information that we share with you today helpful in your work and your advocacy. So you'll hear a lot from my esteemed colleagues today, and I hope that you really find this webinar helpful introduction on renter tax credits, and help you think through some considerations as we push for this housing policy intervention. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Sara Kimberlin, the Executive Director and Senior Research Scholar at Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, and Michelle Laser, Associate Professor of Law at University of San Diego School of Law. Michelle, Dr. Kimberlin, thank you so much for joining us today. Really happy to have you here. Let's kick it off with my first question. I guess for starters, what is a renter tax credit and how would this work?
Michael, I can start by answering that question. And also just thank you so much for inviting me here to be part of this webinar. Very excited to talk about renters tax credits, which I think are a really exciting idea with a lot of interesting issues that can come to the fore here as we have our discussion here. So yes, what is a renter's tax credit? And so I just wanted to highlight sort of the key points of the key basics of a renter's tax credit when we're talking about a tenant-based credit, since I think that's the focus of a lot of our discussion today. So here are the key points. This is a tax credit that's provided when someone is filing their personal income taxes. And this can be done, a renter's tax credit can be done as a federal tax credit or as a state tax credit. And generally, basically what defines it as a renter's tax credit is that it's available to renters who meet certain eligibility criteria. So that could be they have high rent paid compared to their income, could be that they have a low income compared to the fair market rent. It could be just they're a renter with a low income. So we'll talk a little bit more about some more specifics. An important point is the renter's tax credit, it can be made refundable so that low income families and individuals who owe very little or no income taxes can receive the credit as a payment. So that makes a refundable tax credit similar to things like credits that people may be familiar with, like the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit or EITC. And then there's a lot of flexibility possible in the specific design details. So there's some specific proposals that have been put out there. So we'll talk some more about those later, but there's also room within the framework of a renter's tax credit to make some different design choices with some different, to achieve different kinds of policy objectives.
So I'm just going to jump in and add a couple other ways that a renter's tax credit could be designed. And first, I echo Sarah's thank you for inviting us to do this. This is a really great opportunity. We're excited to talk to you about this new possible intervention. Sarah talked about tenant-based renter's tax credits, but another way that a rent tax credit could work would be to provide a tax credit to landlords that compensates them for offering rent reductions to tenants. This kind of RTC is commonly referred to as a landlord side RTC. And the first thing that I would point out is that even though those credits would be claimed by landlords, their purpose would still be to benefit tenants. So there's a couple of ways that a landlord side tax credit might work. First, the credit could still be tenant-based, even though it's not administered on the tenant side. And what I mean by that is, in theory, the tax credit could be designed so that any tenant could go out in the market and find any landlord, and they could negotiate a rent reduction agreement with that landlord. Then the landlord could claim the tenant for the balance. And if the tenant moved to a new unit, they could just negotiate a new agreement with a new landlord, right? But that might be hard to regulate. Without oversight, landlords might overrepresent the amount of the discount, and it might be hard for housing agencies to police and sign off on every agreement that's happening out there in the rental market, right? So in the end, this form probably wouldn't work very well, and that's why nobody has seriously proposed it. The more common way for landlord side RTC proposals to work would be to start by having the government allocate tax credits to specific landlords. So landlords could apply for tax credit allocations, and if they get those tax credit allocations, then they'd enter into a rental reduction agreement with a housing agency. And tenants that rent from that landlord then would receive the benefit of reduced rent. So this is a lot like how project-based housing vouchers work, for those of you who might be familiar with that program. So, I mean, we'll talk more about these things in over the course of the webinar, but I think, the thing that I would just highlight now is that landlord side tax credits do look like a benefit for landlords, but that's not necessarily true. As long as the credit is only big enough to offset the tenant's rent reduction, the economic benefit really should fall primarily on tenants. And landlord side structures might actually have some advantages over tenant side structures when it comes to enforcement and also controlling program size. So that's just a few things to add.
Thanks so much for that quick introduction. And I think for those of you who want to learn more about this, thanks to our comms people at Results, you can check out this quick intro video on the subject of renter tax credits. It's a quick 2-minute video, so feel free to browse and peruse it after today's webinar. And again, we'll make these resources that we talk about and raise during the webinar available with the recording once we're done. So moving on to the next question. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to address rent affordability, housing affordability, and homelessness crisis, right? Where would you place renter tax credit and other similar forms of interventions in the tax code in the spectrum of providing assistance to renters? I know that's a long question, but hopefully you can answer it with give some answers to that. And maybe Shelley, you can get us started.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think that when people hear about renters tax credit, they tend to initially think of them as just a form of public assistance for renters. I'm not sure that that's quite right. All right. An RTC is fundamentally a market intervention. And to understand why I say that, I think it's helpful to compare renters tax credit to housing choice voucher programs. And I know Michael asked about tax interventions, but just bear with me for a second, because I think this is kind of an important point. The voucher program that is kind of the biggest program under current law to assist tenants works by giving vouchers to tenants that they can use to rent from private landlords. They can't use those vouchers for anything else, right? Just housing. And they depend on finding landlords who will take the vouchers. And so ultimately, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is really a demand side market intervention. And it works by creating a market for affordable housing. Renters tax credits would do the same thing, all right? And the reason why I say this is that nearly all RTC proposals, and I mean, Sarah might push back on this a little bit, but all of the RTC proposals that I've seen at the federal level have tied the tax credits directly to rent payments. They either reimburse tenants for some amount of rent paid, or they reimburse landlords for a discount that they're providing to tenants. And any benefit that tenants are receiving under the program is really completely offset by the rent that they paid, right? Yes, they get cash, but only after spending cash on rent. Or if it's a landlord side RTC, they don't get cash at all. And the only benefit that they're getting is going to be in the form of a rent reduction, right? RTCs don't provide unrestricted cash payments to tenants. Instead, they're providing in-kind assistance that's more like housing vouchers than like cash welfare. This is a fundamentally different approach than, say, the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit. Both of those tax credits are cash-based, and they help transfer financial resources directly to tenants without any particular consumption requirements or any involvement of markets. Neither of those programs require the taxpayer to prove that they spent their money in any particular way, and people can use those credits to pay rent. Okay, but they don't have to. They could also use it to repair a car or feed their families or buy clothing or pay off debt or whatever they need, right? So as compared to other interventions, the earned income tax credit and child tax credit provide direct unrestricted cash benefits to tenants. And that's what I would really think of as public assistance. That's different from how the RTC would work, because the RTC would always involve markets. And tenants don't pay rent in a vacuum. They're paying rent to landlords. So before tenants can claim an RTC, some market transaction is taking place. And landlords are going to become part of the story. We'll talk more about limitations later in the webinar, but right now I just want to point out that an RTC would probably affect the behavior of both landlords and tenants in ways that might not be intended or desirable. So we really do need to think hard about our policy objectives. If we think that the problem with high rents is that they contribute to poverty, then getting unrestricted cash in tenants' hands might actually be a more effective policy intervention that presents fewer distortions in the housing market. So that could be achieved through expanding the earned income tax credit or the CTC, or introducing programs like universal basic income or universal basic rent.
Right. And Shelley, just to clarify that, you can also create a renter tax credit that essentially functions the same way as EITC, CTC, or guaranteed income, right?
Yeah, like a more status-based tenant credit that's not specifically tied to having like paid a particular amount of rent would probably be more effective and less distorting.
Yes, thank you, Shelley. Dr. Kimberlin?
Yeah, I'll just respond a little bit, definitely think I agree with Shelley that it's important to sort of think about how things like a renter's tax credit interacts with housing markets and that kind of thing. I will also say I feel like there is a little bit of a distinction in that, for one thing, housing costs and rent is really the largest basic needs expense that people with low incomes face. So saying that a renter's tax credit reimburses for rent, people are already going to be spending a large amount of their resources on rent regardless if they have low incomes in particular. So I think that's one area where, although it's a little bit different from a housing choice voucher in that, it is tied to, maybe the design may tie it to rent paid, but you're going to be spending a lot of your money on rent regardless. And because the tax credit is received as cash, you can actually use it to spend it to repair your car if that's what you end up needing it for, even if it is tied to the fact that you have a rent that is high enough to make you qualify for the credit. So there's a little bit of complexity there, I think, but I think these are issues that are definitely important to sort of think through and think through the different design choices and policy objectives and figure out how to minimize undesired consequences for sure. Just backing up a little bit to the question you originally asked, of thinking about how a renter's tax credit fits into the broad spectrum of policy interventions to address renters' needs. I think a key point is that the interventions that are out there are very important and are really helping a lot of renters meet their needs, but they're still unmet needs. And one of the things that comes out in the research that I've been working on, even after you look at all the interventions out there, you look at the housing choice vouchers and affordable housing, deed restricted affordable housing, existing tax credits like earned income tax credit and child tax credit, you still find that about half of renters face an unaffordable housing cost burden, right? And almost about 1 in 5 face a severe housing cost burden where they're paying more than half their income towards rent. And so there's needs out there that are not being met. And so that's where I think thinking about expanding the toolbox, thinking about, is there something we can do with this vehicle that would help address that need, I think is a really valuable conversation to be having, because the needs are not being met across all the renters who are having challenges with affordability. And one of the features of a renter's tax credit that I think is important to think about is that there is a lot of flexibility in how to design it. So you can look at the full spectrum of available assistance and who is still struggling after we account for everything that's out there, and think about, what is the specific need that needs to be targeted, and is there a way to design policy that would target that? And another thing I think that is compelling about thinking about renters tax credits as a potential vehicle is, you can design it as a shallow subsidy or a deep subsidy. You can target a really narrow segment of renters, or you can target all renters. There's just a lot of, you can design it in a way that layers on top of existing supports. So design questions you would want to make to address each of those kinds of objectives, but that's something you can do. And also another analysis I'm working on right now looks at simulating different kinds of models of renters tax credits in census data, and looking at analyzing who benefits, how many people benefit, what are the demographics of the individuals who would benefit if you did it this way, how does this affect who has a housing cost, rent burden, how does this affect who's in poverty? So I think that kind of analysis is feasible, and I think is useful for thinking through the potential implications of different ways that you can think about structuring this. And I will say, in terms of relative to the whole spectrum of interventions, I do think that if we're talking about a tenant-based renters tax credit, a set of policies that really complement that in an important way are policies that more directly seek to expand the supply of housing units, that just increase the number of units that are out there and available, and particularly the number of units that have an affordable rent. And so thinking about those kinds of policies together, I think makes a lot of sense, because if you, it's really important to expand the actual supply of units for the long-term affordability of rents.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kimberlin. I totally agree, right? We need to look at this from a bird's eye view of like there's the equation of addressing the demand side, but also on the supply side. And I think that sometimes one gets more coverage than the other, and it's really important to think through like what is the like holistic solution to address the housing crisis. Shifting gears a little bit, and I know I'm not supposed to be pulling questions from the Q&A, but someone had just asked, like, do any states have renters tax credits currently in place? And that's actually like my next question to you, Dr. Kimberlin. What are some of the ongoing efforts on the state level with respect to renter tax credits, and are there specific ones that you'd like to share that will be interesting, and if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think an important feature of renters tax credits is you can really do this at the state level. And in fact, there are several states that have some kind of renters tax credit. There's a lot of variation across states also among those that have them. And so I think it's a useful place to look for ideas of different ways that this can be structured. And so there are some states that have, most of the states credits that are out there are small right now. Many of them are not refundable. So that really does limit, some of them are targeted to very narrow populations like seniors only or people with disabilities only. And so that, narrows how broadly these policies reach. But there's a lot of variation there. Some examples that I might point to just as interesting sort of ones that are notable in one way or another. Washington, D.C. has one of the more generous refundable credits. New York State is actually has a child poverty task force that's actively looking at a renter's tax credit as a policy proposal. So if you're sort of interested in a place where the policy questions are being grappled with right now, that's a place that you can look. California is an example. It has a small non-refundable credit currently, but there have been proposals in recent years to build on that in different ways to make it more refundable and larger. So just again, as an example of ways that people have been thinking about how to build off of structures that are there already, ways of structuring it very differently from these larger, more voucher-like proposals at the federal level. And there are definitely different policy constraints at the state level. I mean, we would generally tend to expect either smaller credit size or more targeted eligibility, just because states have much stricter budget constraints. But there is flexibility within this policy generally to be able to accommodate those kinds of constraints. And so, yeah, again, some of the research I'm working on includes modeling, simulating what do these smaller, simpler state credits, what kind of impact do they have in terms of how many renters they reach across, how they affect cost burden or poverty rates or those kinds of things too. So that's also something that's feasible to do with the state credits as well.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? So just to build on what Sarah's saying, my understanding is one reason why state renters tax credits have historically been so small is because one of the like driving policy reason for it is to correct for the fact that landlords often pass property taxes along to tenants in the form of increased rents. Okay. And so the goal is to just, correct that problem, right? And make sure that tenants aren't paying the property taxes for their landlords and bearing that burden. That's why they're not very big. The goal is not to actually achieve affordability through those credits, right? So that's a really different goal than some of the credits we've talked about that are being proposed right now on the federal level that are trying to help actually make housing more affordable for tenants. It doesn't mean that those state tax credits are irrelevant or that they couldn't be scaled up to meet these additional goals, but I think historically that's one explanation for why they have been so laughably small. And they tend to lack these features like refundability or advanced payments, which we'll talk about later. If you need somebody to depend on a tax credit to pay their monthly rent, you need to have it now. You can't wait until the end of the year, right? And so there's a lot of features that you tend not to see in those tax credits. And part of that is just that they're not actually designed to achieve affordability in the same way that they could be. And so, I think that's also a part of this.
Thanks, Professor Lacer. And just to recap, for those of you interested in learning more about what your state is doing or not doing, or what your state has done on renter tax credits, I believe it's already been posted on the chat, but there's a compilation of a tracker that we put together at results, just showing you the depth and breadth of the different types of renter tax credits that already exist on the state level. And we also are looking at not just renter tax credits, but also renter tax deductions, right? We have not talked about the deductions, that there's a different dynamic there, but that's also something that we've been tracking and looking into compared to existing renter tax credits. All right, moving on to the next question. How can renter tax credits help with the current affordable housing and homelessness crisis?
Yeah,
maybe Dr. Kimberlin, you can kick us off.
I would like to start just by highlighting some really big picture points on this. And just this I said before, but just again, existing housing subsidies just really don't reach a lot of struggling renters. So that's where there is really a role to play for other kinds of policies to figure out, how can we make sure that renters' needs are being met, basically. And another point in here, a reason why to think about renters' tax credits in particular, just there are a lot of substantial tax benefits available to homeowners, right? There's the mortgage interest deduction, there's the property tax deductions available, right? So this is a very large amount of tax benefit that is directed to homeowners, and there's really little to nothing specifically for renters. Really, there's nothing specifically for renters at the federal level, and in most cases at the state level, there's either nothing or much smaller levels of support for renters. So from a sort of tax equity point of view, there's room there to think about balancing that out better, right? And so I think this is a reason why there have been some conversations about this. Is this an area where there could be some opportunity for policies here? And then another thing is that just we have seen tax credits offer a really viable vehicle for delivering cash support at scale. So we saw this with the pandemic era stimulus payments, which were structured as tax refunds, right? And also with the expanded federal child tax credit in response to the pandemic. So, we've seen that this is a vehicle that can feasibly be used to direct this cash at a large scale. And it builds on a long prior track record with refundable tax credits like the EITC. So I think these are all reasons where there is potentially an opportunity here to think about this as a vehicle that could play an important role in addressing the housing affordability challenges that people are facing.
Professor Lacer?
Yeah, so I'm just going to add to that. Like Sara said, there are far more housing insecure tenants than the number who get assistance under current law. And the problem is actually even bigger than just, program size and availability of vouchers, for example. I'm going to focus on vouchers because it is like a huge way that we try to assist rent burden tenants. But even when tenants do get vouchers, sometimes they have trouble finding participating landlords. Almost a third of voucher holders can't find a unit within the 60-day period that they're given before they just lose their vouchers. That is a shocking statistic, and it really points to the shortcomings of current law and the need for additional intervention. If a tenant-side RTC were enacted tomorrow, it would immediately convert many tenants' housing into affordable housing without them having to go out into the market to find any participating landlord at all. That would help reduce housing insecurity for a lot of tenants very quickly, helping keep them in their homes, and that would help prevent homelessness. That said, I think reaching the existing homeless population is really hard. The chronically homeless population is particularly difficult to house, and I don't really think that the RTC would reach that group. But to the extent that families may cycle in and out of homelessness, increasing access to affordable housing really should lift some of those families out of homelessness. That said, design is going to matter, right? Any RTC that requires tenants to pay rent first and then wait for a reimbursement probably wouldn't work for a lot of these families. An RTC could provide for advance payments that gets cash into tenants' hands each month, but any tenant who is really relying on those payments as a way to pay rent would probably have to disclose that to their landlords, And we know that lots of landlords discriminate on the basis of source of income. So that, might be a barrier, right? Landlord side RTCs would automatically provide a rent reduction for tenants, and that might be a better fit for tenants who really have very low income. Landlords' income requirements might be lower in that context. On the other hand, that form of credit would also place more burdens on the landlords and give present some, maybe barrier to take up, right? We know that landlords avoid the housing choice voucher program because of compliance concerns, and you might end up seeing similar issues with the landlord side RTC. So I don't know. I think these are challenges. In the end, I just think that the RTC would be really, I think it would go a long way for addressing housing insecurity. I am less sure how well it would work to really address the homelessness problem.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. So moving right along, I know we've talked about how there's no federal renter tax credit yet. What are some of the policy considerations and design elements you'd like to share with our audience today in light of your work in this area? And you kind of talked already about this, like the different types of renter tax credit out there, but maybe it just bears some emphasis and repetition just to help us wrap our minds around this concept of renter tax credits on the federal level.
Sure, I'll start. So like I tell my tax students, every aspect of tax design is ultimately a policy choice. And the RTC is going to present a lot of different policy choices. I do have a paper coming out that discusses a lot of this in detail, but I'll touch on some of the big ones. The first issue I think that has to be addressed is timing. I mentioned this before. Taxpayers pay their taxes and claim credits once a year, but tenants pay rent monthly, right? And so an RTC, if it's going to be useful at all, really needs to pay out monthly as well. Most RTC proposals would provide for advance payments, kind of like the advanced child tax credit that we saw during COVID. And I think that's the right design, but it does raise a couple of issues that are worth noting. First, there's the challenge of making sure that people really receive the payments, especially if they move around or they're unbanked and they don't have the ability to do a direct deposit. The advanced CTC worked pretty well, but according to the GAO, something like 9 to 10 million eligible people never actually received it because, and that included a lot of people who were living in poverty or homeless. So that's simply a logistical challenge. The second problem is that when we pay out advanced tax credits, we're assuming that any overpayment of benefits during the year would be corrected when the taxpayer files their taxes later. Problem is, tenants might not be in a position to pay back the RTC at the end of the year if it turns out they got too much of it, or they might not know that they have to do that. And this could expose them to audits. We know that the IRS targets tax credit claimants. A lot of RTC claimants would also be claiming the earned income tax credit and depending on that subsidy as well. So any increased audit exposure associated with the RTC could also place people's earned income tax credit at risk. So if an RTC is enacted, we really need to think hard about how to protect taxpayers from that problem of potential overly aggressive auditing. It's something the IRS is already addressing, but I think it's essential if we want to keep the RTC from just backfiring on tenants. Other policy considerations relate to the size of the credit. I think, Sara will probably talk a little bit more about this, so I'm only going to say a few things here. Some of the proposed RTCs would provide for just absolutely huge and expensive programs. There are design options that could help control the program size, like offering a shallower subsidy, which is kind of lingo for just saying smaller, not as big of a tax credit. You could restrict the field of eligible tenants, so maybe just restrict it to the very lowest income tenants, or place an overall cap on program size. There's ways to do all of these things, and all of these ideas could help control the program size. But it also means it's more limiting. So part of what we're trying to do is reach as many tenants as possible and give them as much assistance as possible. I mean, this cuts against that, right? Couple other things. At the beginning of the webinar, we mentioned landlord side versus tenant side structures. But a related point there is who we want to bear the compliance burdens associated with a renter's tax credit. Landlords are probably in a better position to deal with the complexity of an RTC than tenants are. But they may also lack an incentive to participate in the program if it's too burdensome. So these are, there's a tension here. Tenants are likely to participate in the program regardless. But it's worth noting that the RTCs could get complicated pretty quickly, and tenants might not be in the best position to navigate that. They may end up relying heavily on tax preparers who they might have to pay for the benefit or otherwise risk auditing. Last thought, just one more before I turn this over to Sara. There's a choice to use a tax-based tool in the first place. Placing a welfare program in the tax system can make sense if the IRS has the expertise and capacities to run the program more efficiently than other agencies. That's arguably true in the context of the earned income tax credit, right? So the IRS is good at measuring income. It has a good system in place for transferring cash to taxpayers. It already knows a lot about our family structures and so forth. It's not clear that running an in-kind housing assistance program through the tax code makes much sense for the perspective of administrative design. The IRS is not an expert in housing, and even the most generous RTC proposals usually include some limit tied to area rental levels, for example. And that would involve coordination with local housing agencies and HUD. In the end, that level of coordination might not make sense from the perspective of institutional design. I also feel a need to mention right now that this is an ode to Barbie that happens on occasion with my computer. I don't know why I'm pink right now, but we're just gonna Barbie it up for the rest of the presentation. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Professor Later. Dr. Kimberlin.
Yeah, I love the pink actually, but I was going to say I have to say I actually don't have as many concerns about the administrative feasibility of doing it. I actually think one of the things that is very compelling about a renter's tax credit is that it really leverages an existing infrastructure that's out there, and I think there's ways that this is helpful both for the people filing to try to access this kind of a support and for the agency administering it. So I think a fundamental issue is that really most Americans across all income levels need to file their taxes anyway. Whether if your income is high enough, you're required to file your taxes. If your income is low, many of the filers with individuals with lower incomes are eligible for other tax credits like the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit. And so they're going to be filing their taxes anyway. So that means there is this whole infrastructure set up that people are already using to file their taxes. They're already reporting a lot of income information. They're already reporting a lot of information about the households that they live with, that kind of thing. Not to say that infrastructure can't be improved. I think there are many ways that can be improved. There could be a lot of work done to make that more accessible and affordable to people with low incomes in particular, right? But it's there anyway, right? And people are having to engage with it anyway. And so that means that channeling a benefit through the tax system has some benefits in that people don't have to go to a separate process to try to access this benefit. They don't have to know specifically very much about it or even know that they're eligible for it. They are likely to be filing their taxes anyway, and so that removes potentially a barrier to people accessing it. So I think that's just an alternative way of thinking about it, and also that there are the tax agency. Again, there's already this system and form in place. So to connect additional data into there, like to have the tax forms automatically link to the fair market rent in the location where a filer lives, I think that's pretty administratively feasible. It definitely would require some, a step on the back end administratively, but there could be ways that compared to other kinds of things like launching a new program that it does not already have that kind of robust infrastructure in place would be more challenging than making those connections on the back end. So, but I definitely think thinking about the administrative feasibility is really important, I think, and thinking about also where are there potential pitfalls also I think is really important. So definitely in alignment on that point for sure. I'll say, yeah, you had originally asked sort of to highlight some of the different kinds of policy considerations and design elements. And I'll say I am also working on a paper that goes into some of these questions with Elizabeth Kneebone, who's at the San Francisco Federal Reserve, that just lays out some questions that policymakers would need to think about in designing renters tax credits, and what are the sort of trade-offs and implications of different choices along those parameters. And so I'll just highlight some of the questions that we've been thinking about, and there's some parallels to some of the questions that Shelley has highlighted as well. So here are some of the things. Asking, is the credit provided per household or per tax filer, right? Because some households include multiple tax filers. So thinking about, how to deal with that. Is eligibility linked to a specific amount of rent paid, or is it linked to how your income compares to the fair market rent or some kind of standard rent? Or is it just linked to your status as a renter without having to document exactly how much rent you paid? How is income counted for purposes of calculating eligibility for the credit? Is it adjusted gross income on the tax form, or do you do some modification to that, which is feasible, right? Because there are other non-taxable income sources reported on tax forms, other ways you can add income up. So, there are some choices that can be made in there. Is the credit available to all renters, or is it targeted to a subset of renters? For example, is it targeted to renters who have income below a certain level? Is it targeted to renters who have an unusually high or unaffordable rent burden compared to their income? Is it targeted to renters? There's many ways you could do it. Renters with children under the age of 6, that's feasible to do. There's different kinds of targeting. There's choices to make made there. Is the credit refundable? That's a very fundamental choice. And I will say some of the analysis that we've looked at is what share of tax units, tax filers with unaffordable rental costs would benefit if it's refundable versus not. And one of the things that I think is an important point is, about half of renters with housing cost burden don't actually wouldn't benefit unless the credit is refundable, because they aren't required to file taxes and they don't have tax liability. So if that's part of the policy objectives, then among the renters with low incomes, that's a key design question to make it refundable or not. Is the credit amount flat, or does it vary? Thinking about the trade-offs there in terms of communicating, in terms of administrating. And then just, again, as Shelley was mentioning, how large is the credit? Is this designed to be a really deep subsidy that really solves someone's entire rental affordability problem? Is it a more shallow subsidy that layers on top of other kinds of policies that are out there that are helping people meet their rental needs? These are all of these, I think, are questions that can be addressed with different kinds of policy design questions. And again, there's a lot to think about across of each of these, but also there's a lot of people who are thinking about these questions. And so, whether there was information coming out that we're working on, that Shelley's working on. So I think there will be more conversations to engage in. And I will say, speaking for myself, I'm always looking to understand the questions that people are asking and thinking about what kinds of analyses can help inform those kinds of questions. So this is another reason I'm really glad to be here in this conversation as we're kind of thinking these things through.
Thank you, Dr. Kimberlin. So in addition to state level renter tax credits, right, there are other tax and housing policy interventions on whether you look at it from the federal, state, or local levels, that we could either draw parallels to or learn lessons from. And I think both of you have been touching on this in your answers to my previous questions, but can you talk about some of these similar or related policies? And Professor Lacer, maybe you can get us started.
Yeah, so I have talked about some of this already. Like I said earlier, I think the best way to understand an RTC is as a market intervention that's a lot like housing vouchers. So to understand what impact an RTC might have on rental markets, it's helpful to look at how landlords and tenants have responded to housing choice vouchers. It's well documented that voucher holders are willing to rent higher rent units with a voucher than they would without it, because part of the rent that they would have been responsible for is capped under the voucher program. It's also well documented that landlords raise rents to take advantage of the fact that the tenant doesn't care. And HUD's rent limits often provide some room for landlords to raise their rents above the market rates in low-income neighborhoods. We would probably see some of the same distortions under an RTC. For example, tenants might seek out housing that's more expensive than they would have rented otherwise. Sometimes that might be okay, right? Especially if we think that their previous housing was substandard. Other times it might just make the program more costly than it needs to be. Landlords are also likely to raise rents to take advantage of the fact that the government is essentially footing the bill for a lot of the rent. So, I don't know that any of this rises to the point where we say, and therefore we absolutely shouldn't do it. But I do think we need to be realistic about what we can expect to see and some of the unintended consequences that might follow from using this particular type of approach. I think that some of these distortions are very much inherent to the kind of market-based form of an RTC. And you'd see more of these issues in this form of intervention than you might in something that's a little bit more directly cash-based.
And I think Professor Laser, just piggybacking from that, right? Like there's also this dynamic of going back to the lack of supply of affordable housing, right? Like if you're in a neighborhood when there's literally no affordable housing and you are forced to pay more, that is also the dynamic that we might run into. Dr. Kimberlin, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting questions with the thinking about how it affects the supply of housing units is really relevant. And I mean, there is a piece that if a policy were put in place that housing developers knew that this was going to be a longstanding policy, that more people would have more resources to be able to afford housing, that could in itself incentivize the development of more housing units too. So thinking through all of the different ways and trying to understand and play out and analyze the different ways this could the implications across behaviors of renters and landlords, I think is really important, I will say. And also considering, again, coupling a policy like this with policies that are more explicitly directly connected to expanding housing supply, I think also makes a lot of sense. But some bigger picture points that I would also add in terms of sort of thinking, your original question, I think, was thinking about how this connects to or relates to other kinds of housing policies out there. I will say, as a tax credit, I think there are a lot of lessons that we learned from the pandemic expansions of refundable tax credits that are really directly relevant to this conversation about creating or expanding on renters' tax credits. And I think a lot of that experience was eye-opening in a lot of ways, just to see that this is a kind of a policy tool that can successfully be deployed at scale. And that was true with both federal tax agencies and with state tax agencies. And just to see like the fact that advanced monthly payments were made with the federal child tax credit, I think was remarkable in a lot of ways, that nothing like that had been tried before. And that was rolled out at a grand scale. I think, as Shelley was mentioning, definitely there's still room for improvement there, but considering it was done only once so far, I think there would be also time for improvement there. So I think it piques my interest, right, in terms of thinking that, oh, this is a tool that could be exploited more fully potentially, right? I think it makes it worth thinking about in that way. And that it's, again, able to reach a wide swath of households also is compelling. I'll say, connecting sort of to the conversation we had about how is this similar or different to earned income tax credit or child tax credit as other policies that are out there. I will say some of the analyses that I've been working on with my co-authors do look at sort of what is the population of tax filers who have a high rent burden? How does that overlap with the population of tax filers who are eligible for the EITC and the population of tax filers who are eligible for the child tax credit? And the interesting thing is, right, there isn't perfect overlap there, right? So what this means is there are many rent burdened, many tax filers who have unaffordable rents who are eligible for EITC or child tax credit. But there are also many renters who are not eligible for those other tax credits, right? They're also, so that means just expanding the EITC, for example, or expanding the child tax credit is not going to reach everyone who is struggling to pay their rent, because there are people who are struggling with rent who aren't eligible for those other credits. At the same time, there are a substantial, segment of the tax filers who are eligible for EITC or are eligible for child tax credit who actually live in ownership housing. They don't live in rental housing. So in some cases, they may live in an extended family that is in ownership housing. They may not own the home themselves, but they are not in a position where they're paying rent. So that means that if you are just expanding the EITC with the idea that all of the benefits are flowing to renters, that would not be an accurate thought, right? And so thinking about sort of how, again, thinking about the whole picture of supports that are out there and how they overlap, I think is really helpful for thinking about productive ways of targeting. So this is just to say that just expanding the EITC or just expanding the child tax credit wouldn't directly, would benefit some homeowner households and would also not reach all renters. But at the same time, these are really, people are using these resources to pay their rent. So thinking about the role that these credits are playing in helping people afford their rent is also important. And there's analyses you can do that look at all these things directly. And so some of the work I'm working on with researchers at the Columbia Center for Social Poverty, and I'm getting their name wrong. Let me make sure I get this accurately. Columbia Center for Poverty and Social Policy. Thank you.
It's a handful. It's a handful. Yes.
Look specifically at some of these questions, sort of how do these things overlap and how do they interplay? And so I think these are important questions to be thinking about too.
Great. And thank you for all of that. I guess like my last questions, because I know like we're getting close to 2 p.m. Eastern time. Like other housing interventions, a renter tax credit would have limits. And I think both of you have kind of been alluding to talking about some of these limits depending on, the design considerations and the policy goals. But could you talk about, specifically some of these limitations and how could those limitations be addressed? And I think some of the questions that I'm seeing pop up is also focused around like what are, talked about limitations.
Yeah, so we have touched on some of this, but I'll just try to kind of summarize it in response to your question. I think that broadly, a lot of the limits that I see related to the RTC relate to two features, right? The first is that the RTC would be a market intervention, right? And not direct cash, that's going to carry some implications. And the second set of limits are related to the fact that these are tax-based, right? So I'll take each of these in turn and just kind of recap. I've said some of this already, but the market intervention form does have implications for what we can expect to see from an RTC. An RTC would be a really fast way to convert many tenants on unaffordable housing into affordable housing, and that's great. But it's also going to create market distortions. And I think that the most likely and concerning distortions are likely to happen on the landlord side under almost every design of an RTC. Landlords are likely to raise rents to take advantage of the subsidy. And that could prevent problems for tenants who are ineligible for an RTC, right? So for example, it's not clear whether undocumented immigrants would end up being eligible for an RTC. And if an RTC functions to just raise rents in markets across the board, it might actually make housing more unaffordable for those groups of tenants. In addition, it could also, in the end, even despite the fact that it could initially really help tenants, it could weirdly put some tenants at risk of eviction. If the landlord isn't able to raise rents on existing tenants and sees an opportunity to re-rent their unit at a higher rate, they may be inclined to seek, to find excuses to evict their tenants in order to do that, right? And so that's, a kind of a unintended and problematic result if that were to happen. I also think that the RTC would just be kind of limited in its ability to to address some of the problems that tenants do face and create instability for tenants, in addition to affordability. So, for example, I think tenants would continue to experience a lot of discrimination in rental markets, and I just don't think the RTC would do much to fix that, especially if tenants have to disclose their reliance on the tax credits in order to secure housing. So, you know, again, these aren't necessarily reasons not to support an RTC, but they are going to be limits with respect to what an RTC can do. One advantage of cash transfers or an expanded cash-based program is that it could increase tenants' ability to pay rent without triggering as many market distortions. And so some of those limits would be less in that context. However, like Sara said, those approaches don't specifically address housing. They don't create any specific incentives for landlords to lease to low-income tenants. They may not automatically adjust, you know, they're not going to be reflected in lower rent prices. So, you know, if the focus really is on housing in particular and not poverty more generally, those approaches might not be as effective. Okay, then there are limits just associated with the tax-based form, right? So this is a tax-based intervention. And so eligibility for the tax credits would almost certainly be tied to tax-based definitions of income. And those are different than the definitions of income that are typically used for cash welfare programs. Tax definitions of income tend to ignore certain kinds of income, for example, and they completely ignore taxpayers' wealth, which is a big part of their, you know, ability to afford to pay for something like housing, right? So it might actually identify some people as having lower ability to afford rent than they actually have, and that's just something to be aware of. The tax-based form would also raise some issues related to timing of payments and responsiveness to changes in tenants' income level. So, you know, like I said earlier, advanced payments would help a lot with timing. But responsiveness to changes in income over the course of the year could still be a problem, especially if the size of the credit is tied to the prior year's income level. And that could create issues where the incentives, the credit isn't as big as it, you know, preferably would be, or maybe it's too big and now the tenant ends up with a kind of audit concern. And that's just a feature of, you know, the inability to kind of just regularly reassess things to the tax system. It's not that it couldn't be done, but it would be hard, and it's not done under current programs. I mentioned audit concerns already, but it is worth reiterating that any refundable tax credit, so not just the RTC, but also the earned income tax credit, just brings more taxpayers under IRS scrutiny. A lot of tenants wouldn't have to file taxes at all, given their low income levels. So when they're filing just to claim these refundable credits, they're opening themselves up to audits and privacy violations that they wouldn't otherwise face, and they're ending up dealing with new compliance burdens, and may end up paying paid tax preparers to help navigate that system that they otherwise wouldn't have to navigate. Now, you know, how much of a concern should we have about this, given that a lot of RTC claimants would already be claiming the earned income tax credit and CTC, and therefore facing all of these issues already? Yeah, I don't know, but like Sara said, there are plenty of tenants who are not claiming those benefits, right? And so you probably are bringing some people into this system and exposing them to additional interaction that maybe they wouldn't have had to deal with previously.
Dr. Kimberlin, we have about 4 or 5 minutes if you'd like to respond to.
I'll just briefly add a couple of responses. And I'll say, I mean, again, I fully agree it's important to think through sort of all the potential implications and sort of intended and unintended consequences. I do also think there are a lot of choices that you can make in how you structure a credit, or what kinds of documentation you require, how you administer it, that allow you to address a lot of the concerns that might be raised. And so I think, you know, like more scrutiny, you know, you can choose what kind of documentation is required. You know, I think a key sort of central question is that when thinking about sort of administrative efficiency or the burdens on the people who are trying to access support, I think the relevant question is, how does this compare to the practical policy alternatives we have? And so is it easier for an individual to navigate filing their taxes, or is it easier to navigate filing for benefits through a public housing authority? There's still a lot of scrutiny involved with certifying your income for a housing choice voucher as well. There's a recertification processes that are involved. So it's, I think sort of any type of benefit that is flowing out to people is going to involve some compliance issues and some scrutiny. And so I think that's sort of the relevant question, and sort of making sure that the burden is minimized as much as it can be, so that not so that it's accessible to people, and thinking about how to structure it in a way that makes sense. It's important to think through these implementation questions, but I think there are solutions to a lot of these questions if you think through it. Similarly, is it more expensive to administer a tax credit through the existing income tax system, or is it more expensive to establish and administer a new program that would flow through like a public housing authority or something? That's a comparison you can kind of calculate and look at. And so I think, having that sort of framework, I think is useful to sort of see, okay, what are the implications? How can they be minimized with different kinds of policy choices if there are undesired burdens or undesired consequences? And I do think there are, like, one of the things that is compelling about tax credits generally is that there are a lot of different choices you can make in terms of how to implement it, in terms of what information to require from people filing their taxes, in terms of what kinds of documentation to require. And these can be ways to address some of these concerns. I will say that one of the questions that is really important to ask in terms of directing help for renters through tax credits is to think through carefully who risks being missed by something like a renter's tax credit. So in particular, I would think about individuals who have no other reason to file their taxes because they're not required to file and they're not eligible for other kinds of tax credits that are out there, like the child tax credit or EITC. But I think that just means a couple of things. One, that you would need to think specifically about strategies to reach them. So special kinds of outreach strategies or automated filing or those kinds of things. And then also to think about, again, going back to the question you asked earlier, Michael, of how does this fit into the sort of broader scheme of all the different approaches that are out there to try to help people who are struggling to afford their rent? And it may be that if people are unlikely to be reached by a renter's tax credit, it's more appropriate to think about making sure they're being reached by some other kind of policy, like housing choice vouchers or deed restricted housing that is specifically for seniors, or increases in the benefits for SSI recipients, or there's different ways of thinking through other ways to reach people, sort of once you've identified who is likely to be reached, who is at risk of being left out, and what can be done to kind of address that kind of gap.
Thank you both. Well, we're getting towards the end. Before we actually transition to the Q&A, there are a bunch of great questions that have popped up in the Q&A box. And if folks have any other questions, please feel free to do so now. I just want to say thank you both so much, Professor Lister and Dr. Kimberlin, for joining me today. And thanks to our sponsors, the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice, Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence, Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and the ABA section of taxation. Before we transition to Q&A, I'd ask my colleague again if we can launch the second polling questions that we have for you. And this is just helping us gauge on how helpful this conversation and this webinar has been. So, how much do you agree with the following statement? As a result of this webinar, I learned more about renter tax credit. So the same options as you were filling out earlier: strongly disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. And we'll give folks 10 seconds to fill this out, and then we'll move on to the next question, and then we'll move forward with the Q&A. Okay, thank you. The next question is, what additional programming would be helpful to support your work on renter tax credits and other ways that the tax code can help renters? So if you want to, we'll give it 15 seconds for folks to fill that out. And then if it merits follow-up, you'll hear back from the ABA or from me. Thank you. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions that came in during our talk. And I think two of them really get to the topic that you've both been discussing in terms of the market distortions and the impact of a possible renter tax credits and how it influences landlord and tenant behaviors. So one of the questions was, do you think this would cause, do you think renter tax credits would cause landlords to inflate their rents? Would broader rent control measures work better? There was also a similar related question of like, will renter tax credit increase inflation of consumer products? And if so, would that cancel out the benefit to low income renters? Is there anything that can be done to address that?
So, I mean, I think like Sarah said, I think that there's a lot would turn on the design of the credits. So one of the reasons why we see so much rent inflation under housing choice vouchers is the difference between what the rent cap is and the actual market rents in low income areas. And so if a landlord is renting out a unit in a low income area that has a monthly rent of $700 in the market, but the rent limit under the program is $1,000, the landlord has a reason to go ahead and just like up the rent in order to take advantage of that, what's being allowed under the program. And tenants don't have much reason to push back because their rent is being capped. Some of the RTC proposals out there would work in a very similar way. It would set a very similar cap on what the landlord's rent could be charged, and it would effectively reimburse tenants for any rent paid above a certain percentage of their income, right? And so between the two, if you enacted an RTC like that, and some of the leading proposals right now would work exactly like that, I think that you would see a lot of the same rent inflation as you see under the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And I think you would see it at a greater scale because there's just more people engaging in it. And I think that could honestly be a really big problem that could really backfire. That said, it depends on the design. You wouldn't have to design a renter tax credit like that. You wouldn't have to tie it so directly to some percentage of a taxpayer's income. You could, come up with some different way to limit the rental amount that maybe is like a look back that kind of incorporates a rent control element. I mean, there are other things that we can think about that would potentially be less distorting. Your questions about inflation are interesting. I haven't given a lot of thought to that. I don't know, maybe Sara has some ideas about that kind of spillover. But, I do think that the market impact of something like this is something we should, really work hard to understand before implementing an intervention that's just like, of the scale that some of these RTCs, would be.
Dr. Kimberlin?
Yeah, I think I would just echo the point that there are a lot of design choices you can make that could help minimize some of the distortions, and so that would be kind of an important thing to think through. I think the more a credit that's targeted to a more narrow subset of renters, a credit that is designed to be sort of a partial help with part of people's rent burdens, but not close maybe the entire gap between the fair market rent and their income. These are different ways where it becomes less sort of directly translatable into an amount of rent that could be increased, by a landlord. I think there are different ways to sort of think through, what would or would not be likely to trigger more distortions. And again, coupling it with policies that aim at increasing the housing supply, I think also is directly relevant there. So, and also just to sort of point out that these are not it's not creating new problems that aren't already issues that people struggle with or are working to address with things like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, for example, right? So so there are which is both to say that it's not necessarily a new issue, and that there are kind of strategies to think through how to minimize the distortion. So I think those are think there are options there to help address that. And again, the issues would be the largest with a fully expansive, a credit that provided the full benefit up to the fair market rent for every renter in the country. It's pretty unlikely that that would be the form that a policy would actually take, especially first implemented. And so
Looks like we lost Dr. Kimberlin a little bit. See if we can get her back in a minute.
dear.
Dr. Kimberlin, can you, sorry,
Sorry.
you cut out, sorry. So like the last
That's all right.
30 seconds.
No, I was just going to add that I think there's a role for other sorts of thinking through the role of other sorts of tenant protection policies as well. So things like just cause eviction and maximum rent increases, those kinds of things can be layered on or sort of thought about in complementary ways as well, potentially.
Thank you. So the next question, actually, I really like this question because it does get into this like question of poverty and choice, right? When we talk about people living in poverty, you don't really have a choice, and you're subject to the economic conditions of where you're located, where you're living. And so there's a question of like, how would a renter tax credit helping renters move to better neighborhoods? And this person is thinking about Raj Shetty's research regarding child outcomes, improving related to moving to higher income neighborhoods. Is that something that you've looked into or explored in your research?
Yeah, so I love this question. I think it's a really important thing. It's a different goal than just creating affordability. I think that renters tax credits could, very effectively create more affordable housing for people in the units that they already live in, for example. And the question I have is, what about people who need to access housing in different neighborhoods, or maybe they're trying to get housing in the first instance, move out of homelessness, and that's about access, right? And it's also about choice and mobility and options, and all of those things ultimately depend on how landlords respond to this thing, right? I mean, I think that an RTC would increase people's ability to afford housing, more housing than they pay now, right? So I mentioned that previously. Sometimes that's okay. If we think that it's important for people to be able to afford more expensive neighborhoods, for example, and that's going to contribute to economic mobility and health and all kinds of benefits for those families, might be okay with that if they are able to afford more expensive housing because of this credit. The question that I have is, whether a tenant, seeking housing in these areas is going to find a landlord who is ready to rent to them. Are they going to make their units available? That has been a challenge under the voucher program. We see, it's not that tenants don't want to move out of their neighborhoods, but, historically, a lot of tenants have ended up using their vouchers, not only in their same, little area or similar types of neighborhoods, but often in the very same unit that they were renting before they were awarded a voucher. This tells you something about how well the voucher program has been effective for achieving mobility and choice. It's not totally ineffective, but it's not nearly as effective as we wish it would be. And I do worry that an RTC would suffer from a lot of those same kind of limitations. I think if landlords aren't stepping up to, lease to tax credit holding renters, they might not have as much choice as we wish that they would have.
Dr. Kimberlin?
I'll just respond by saying I think there's a lot of choices to make about, you can structure a renter's tax credit where it really doesn't involve a lot of direct involvement by landlords. Like if you just give the money to the tenants without requiring the landlord to sign off on something, they have just a lump sum of money, they can take that wherever they like. So I think there are ways that it can work that don't trigger those concerns as much. And I guess another piece of it that I think is worth considering is sort of unpacking the reasons why landlords might be less willing to engage with the voucher program, and if where that's related to issues like dealing with unit inspections or dealing with public housing authorities. Some of those issues would go away with a renter's tax credit, right? And so, I think that there are ways where I personally would be less concerned about that. I think it's sort of one of the more compelling reasons for considering directing these kinds of benefits through a tax credit instead. I think there is something compelling too about the idea that, by directing resources to tenants based on sort of how large their household is and how much housing, how much rent that they need to be able to afford, that could potentially unlock the potential for them to move out of substandard housing or housing that was overcrowded or those kinds of, problematic housing situations to be able to have the resources to move to opportunity neighborhoods or other, more adequate housing. So I think there's potential there personally.
Great. We have one last question. I think I answered most of the questions as well by responding to them on the Q&A box. But the last question, I think maybe Professor Lacer, this might be for you, but how can someone determine whether a landlord who's asking for a particular level of rent is effectively passing that on the property taxes? Is there a way?
I don't think that you could. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess, if you really saw a property tax increase followed by a rent increase, that would be suggestive that that's what's happening. Otherwise, I mean, the question of who's bearing the burden of taxes is always a difficult one, right? When we talk about who's claiming a credit or who's paying a tax, that's not always the same person who's actually benefiting from or bearing the burden of the tax. It's a difference between the legal incidents and the economic incidents. And this is the kind of thing that's the subject of many economic articles, and many research papers have been written trying to understand, really who's bearing the burden of property taxes in rental properties, for example. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure some very bright economists could give you a much crisper answer for how to model that and how to predict it. But I don't know. I just think it's something that is at least theoretically likely and something that is assumed to happen and probably observed in some instances. And so, to the extent that that's something that we don't want to see, states have long responded to that by offering some kinds of benefits like the small rental tax credits in order to help offset that impact.
Great. Well, we're over time, 2 minutes over time, but really thank you so much for sticking around, for answering these questions, and for our audience for spending, the past 77 minutes with us. We'd like to express our gratitude again to our esteemed group of colleagues here. You're all doing some critical work, and we thank you for your time to join us. Again, the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. So we hope this helps you in your work or think through some of the work that you're doing in the housing tax policy world. Right, this is such an intersectional issue that I think is gaining a lot of traction and interest on the Hill and also with advocates across the country. Feel free to check out the ABA website. Hopefully my colleagues can post that on